Part 1: The Unearthed Ground. The rain had been falling for 3 days straight, soaking the fields that surrounded the Morris estate until they looked like pools of black glass. From the road, the house appeared half swallowed by mist, its upper windows glowing faintly like the eyes of something alive and waiting. Ivy strangled the outer walls, and the wrought iron gate, once proud and golden, now hung on one hinge, squealing in the wind. Inside, Elias Morris stood before a cracked window pane, watching a group of hired workers laboring in the garden below. The soil had given way beneath one of the stone walls that lined the family cemetery, and he had reluctantly agreed to have it repaired before it collapsed completely. Elias was a tall man, thin and pale, with the weary dignity of someone who had inherited not just wealth but a curse. Every few seconds his eyes flicked toward the spot where the workers were digging, a spot he had silently prayed they would never touch. From behind him came the soft sound of footsteps. "Still watching them?" a voice asked. It was Clara, his younger sister. She entered the room wrapped in a shawl of dark blue wool, her auburn hair pinned up neatly despite the humidity. Her expression was curious but gentle. She was used to her brother's moods, to the shadows that seemed to follow him since their parents' deaths. "They've uncovered something," Elias murmured, his voice tight. "Near the elm tree." Clara moved closer, peering through the glass. The workers had indeed stopped digging. They were kneeling around something rectangular jutting from the mud, something wooden, darkened with age. "It looks like a chest," she said quietly. Elias said nothing. His hand clenched against the window frame. The rain thudded harder, drumming against the roof above them like restless fingers. Moments later, one of the workers, a burly man named O'Connor, gave a shout. "Sir, you'd best come see this." Elias hesitated, then turned and strode for the door, leaving Clara behind. She followed despite his sharp look of warning. Outside, the air smelled of wet earth and decay. Mud clung to their boots as they crossed the yard. The workers stood in a loose circle, their faces uneasy. In the center lay a half-rotten wooden casket, smaller than a coffin, its lid carved with the faint outlines of a cross now eaten away by time. "No grave marker," O'Connor muttered. "This weren't part of the family plot, sir. We'd have known." Elias stared at the object, his breath shallow. Beneath the rain, his voice trembled. "Cover it. Now." The men exchanged glances. "You don't want us to open it first? Could be a chest, not a—" "I said cover it." Elias's tone cracked like a whip. "And then you'll all leave for the day. You'll be paid double. Just bury it again." O'Connor frowned, but the promise of money ended the argument. They lowered the shovels and began filling the hole, mud slapping against the wood with heavy, wet sounds. Elias turned away, jaw tight, refusing to look. Clara stood still, rain soaking her hair. Something in her chest tightened. She could swear she heard a sound coming from beneath the shovels, a faint thud, then another, like someone gently knocking from inside. When she blinked, the noise stopped. That night, the storm worsened. The house groaned as wind slammed against its shutters. Elias locked himself in his study, pretending to read by candlelight but never turning a page. Clara sat alone in her room, a book forgotten in her lap. Every few minutes she thought she heard something, a scraping sound along the floor as if nails dragged across the wooden boards beneath the rug. At first she dismissed it as the wind. But then came the unmistakable rhythm of knocking, slow, deliberate, from somewhere under the floorboards. 3 knocks. Pause. Then 2. She rose, heart pounding. "Elias?" she called softly. No answer. She lit a small oil lamp and stepped into the hallway. The corridor was long and cold, lined with portraits whose painted eyes followed her. The knocking grew louder, not random now but almost patterned, like a hand trying to remember a language long forgotten. It led her toward the main staircase. There, on the landing below, the moonlight from a high window revealed something strange. Streaks of mud, trailing across the marble floor, smeared in the shape of footprints. Bare feet. Small. Clara froze. At that moment, a door creaked open down the hall. Elias emerged, pale and tense. "You heard it too," he said. It wasn't a question. She nodded. "It's coming from beneath us." Elias's gaze darted toward the floor. "Go back to bed," he whispered. "Whatever it is, it's nothing new." "Nothing new," Clara repeated. "Elias, what's—" He cut her off sharply. "Please, Clara. Not tonight." The next morning dawned gray and still. The storm had passed, leaving the air thick with mist. When Clara went to call the workers to resume their repairs, she found the yard empty. Their tools lay scattered, their carts still hitched to the horses, but the men were gone. She found a note pinned to the fence, written in O'Connor's rough hand. We don't work where the ground knocks back. Elias burned the note without a word. By midday, the smell of damp earth filled the house again. Clara found clumps of soil near the main hall, as though someone had walked through the night with wet feet. Elias claimed not to notice, though his hands trembled as he poured his tea. That evening, the grandfather clock in the hall stopped ticking. The air grew heavy, thick with silence. And somewhere deep within the walls, something began to move again, softly at first like a whisper of soil shifting. Then came the knocking. 3 beats. Pause. 2 beats. Just as before. Clara covered her ears, but the sound continued, not from the floor this time but from the wall behind her bed. She could no longer deny it. Whatever the workers had unearthed beneath the garden wasn't meant to be disturbed. And it wasn't resting anymore. Part 2: The Ledger and the Lie. The morning after the second knocking, the Morris estate felt different, not haunted but awake. The air in the halls was still yet charged, like a room holding its breath. Clara moved through the house with the quiet dread of someone who already knew she wasn't alone. Every creak of the floorboard seemed deliberate, every whisper of wind at the windows almost human. Elias avoided her eyes at breakfast, pretending to read the paper, though his hands trembled enough to rattle the china. He didn't look up even when she asked, "What did you mean last night, when you said it's nothing new?" His silence said everything. He folded the newspaper, stood abruptly and said, "There are things best left where they lie." Then he left the room, leaving the smell of coffee and dread behind him. Clara couldn't shake the memory of those words, nor the sound that had followed her all night, a faint dragging like nails across wood. She decided she had to know what her brother was hiding. While Elias spent the afternoon in town, Clara searched his study. The room was as cold and neat as a mausoleum. The fire had long gone out, and dust lay across the desk in a thin, undisturbed sheet, except for one place where a large leather-bound book sat open. A family ledger. Inside, neat columns listed names, birth dates, deaths and property transactions. But further in, near the middle, the handwriting changed. The ink darkened, the pen strokes grew violent. Entries became frantic, almost ritualistic. A passage dated October 1854 caught her eye. "The child has been sealed away per the pact. The blood must not continue." Beneath that, another line written weeks later, "It knocks. Even buried it knocks." Clara's breath caught. She turned the page and found a final entry. "If the seal breaks, we must restore it with our own." The rest of the page was blank except for a dark brown stain, something that might once have been blood. A faint sound echoed then, a shuffle from the hallway. Clara froze, her fingers still resting on the ledger. The door creaked open and Elias stood there, his expression unreadable. "You shouldn't have read that," he said quietly. His voice wasn't angry, it was resigned. "You've woken it now." Clara stepped back, clutching the book. "What was sealed, Elias? What did they do?" For a long moment he said nothing. Then he closed the door and locked it behind him. "Our great-grandfather, Silas Morris, was a man of ambition," he began, pacing slowly. "He wanted heirs, strong blood, something that would keep the family name eternal. But our grandmother, his daughter, was born sickly, weak. He blamed her mother for that weakness. And when his wife died in childbirth, he swore to purify the bloodline. He found something, or someone, to help him. A man from the old world. They called him the Speaker Beneath. He taught Silas the pact, the blood right. Every generation, one child must be offered to seal the house's fortune, to keep its soul intact. The ledger you're holding isn't just a record. It's a warning." Clara felt sick. "You're telling me there's a—" She couldn't finish. Elias nodded. "A child buried beneath this estate. A Morris by blood. The last one was buried in 1854. Our uncle. They said he died in sleep, but they sealed him in that casket alive." Clara's stomach turned, the world spinning around her. "Then what we heard, what I saw, it's him?" Elias didn't answer, but the look in his eyes was enough. He took the ledger from her trembling hands and stared down at the ink-stained page. "When Father died, he told me to never disturb the earth near the old elm. He said the pact would hold only as long as the soil remained untouched. But the storm, the collapse, it's broken now." Clara stepped closer, her voice trembling. "Then we need to bless it, seal it again." "We can," Elias cut her off. "It doesn't work like that. The pact was sealed in blood. To restore it, blood must answer blood." He looked at her then, not with anger but sorrow. "That's why I didn't want you involved." Clara's pulse raced. "Elias, no. You can't mean—" But before she could finish, the candles flickered violently. A deep creaking sound rolled through the house. followed by a low moan that seemed to rise from the floor itself. Dust drifted from the ceiling as the air thickened. The knocking began again, louder this time, closer. Elias dropped the ledger and grabbed Clara's wrist. "We need to go." They ran into the hall, the sound chasing them through the corridors like footsteps buried in the walls. Portraits shook on their hooks, the faces of long-dead ancestors seeming to twist and watch as they passed. When they reached the main staircase, the ground beneath them gave a sharp crack. Clara screamed as the floorboards split apart, revealing black earth below, and a glimpse of something pale, small, and moving. They stumbled back, hearts pounding. Elias stared down into the widening crack, his face ashen. "It's him," he whispered. "He's trying to come home." Clara could only stare. In that moment she saw it clearly, a child's hand pushing weakly through the soil, fingers slick with mud, reaching for the light. The air filled with a stench of rot and iron. Elias fell to his knees, shaking his head, tears cutting through the dirt on his face. "I should never have let them dig," he murmured. "The pact is broken, Clara. It's over." The knocking ceased suddenly, replaced by silence so complete it rang in their ears. And then from somewhere deep beneath the floor, came a faint, rasping voice. It spoke a single word, one neither of them had heard in years, yet somehow recognized instantly. "Brother." Clara clutched Elias's arm as the ground began to pulse, like a heartbeat. The forgotten child, the one buried in secret beneath their family's lies, was awake. And it was calling for the blood that had sealed it there. Part 3: The Child Beneath the Floorboards. The house felt alive that night, not with warmth or breath, but with the slow pulse of something ancient reclaiming its body. Every wall seemed to throb faintly, as if a heart buried within the foundation had begun to beat again. The candles that Clara lit would not hold their flame for more than a few moments, flickering out as though suffocated by unseen hands. Elias sat motionless at the edge of the gaping crack that split the grand hallway, staring into the black pit below where they had seen the child's hand. His face was gray, his eyes hollowed by disbelief. Clara stood behind him, trembling, clutching the ledger tight to her chest as if it could keep the darkness from swallowing them. The whisper from beneath the floor still lingered in her ears, soft, desperate, impossibly human. "Brother." The sound had not been imagined. It had come from below, from the grave that should never have been disturbed. Elias finally spoke, his voice little more than a broken whisper. "It remembers." Clara looked at him, her throat tight. "What does it want?" He turned his head slowly, the candlelight drawing strange shadows across his face. "What was taken from it? What was promised? The pact was sealed with a child's blood, Clara. It wasn't just a sacrifice, it was an exchange. The Morris line was given prosperity, protection, life, and in return the child's soul was bound beneath this house to guard it, to wake if it was betrayed." He ran a hand through his hair, shaking. "And we betrayed it the moment we dug near the old elm. The moment we touched the earth that held its casket." The air grew colder, each breath turning visible in the faint light. From somewhere deep within the floorboards came a faint dragging sound, like tiny fingers tracing along the wood from beneath. Clara dropped to her knees and pressed her ear to the ground. There was movement below, slow, wet, rhythmic. She flinched and pulled back. "It's moving," she whispered. "It's not resting anymore." Elias nodded grimly. "Then it's begun." He rose, grabbing an old lantern from the wall. "We can't wait for it to come to us. We have to find where they buried him before he finds his way out." They descended into the cellar, where damp stone walls glistened with moisture and the smell of rot was stronger. The flicker of the lantern revealed dozens of old crates, forgotten furniture, and mold-darkened portraits draped in torn sheets. Water dripped from somewhere unseen, each drop echoing like a metronome for the dead. Clara stayed close to Elias, her steps hesitant. "You said he was sealed near the old elm," she murmured. "But that's outside. Why here?" Elias held the lantern higher. "The roots of that tree reach under the house. The casket was buried deep, beneath the foundation itself, so that the house would stand upon his body. So that every beam, every brick, would bear the weight of the sacrifice." He found a section of the floor where the stone looked newer, the mortar still pale and dry compared to the surrounding walls. Dropping to one knee, he traced a hand along the edge. "Here," he said. "This is where the pact was sealed." He set the lantern down and began prying at the edges with an iron rod. The stone shifted with a groan. Clara wanted to stop him, but something deeper, a mix of dread and desperate curiosity, kept her still. The stone lifted at last, revealing black soil beneath, wet and glistening like open flesh. And then came the smell, sweet, decayed, unmistakably human. Elias gagged, covering his mouth. "God forgive us," he whispered. Beneath the soil, a piece of rotted wood emerged, followed by what looked like a tiny pale finger pressing weakly upward. Clara screamed, stumbling back, the ledger falling from her arms and bursting open on the floor. The candlelight flickered violently, and a sudden gust of cold air rushed through the cellar, extinguishing the lantern. Darkness swallowed them whole. From that darkness came a sound, soft at first like the cooing of an infant, then twisting into a ragged moan that rose and fell like breath. Clara clutched Elias's coat. "Do something," she hissed, her voice shaking. "We can't just stand here." Elias fumbled with the lantern, striking the flint until light burst forth again. When it did, both of them froze. The casket was open. The lid had split down the center, the wood fractured and slick. Inside lay the remnants of a child's body, skeletal, crumbling, but with patches of flesh still clinging as though preserved by something unnatural. Around its neck hung a rusted chain bearing the family's crest. But what froze them most wasn't the body, it was the face. The skin, what little remained, was shifting, slowly knitting itself, forming new muscle, new expression. The eyes opened, milky white and glistening, staring directly at them. Elias staggered back, horror twisting his features. "That's impossible," he murmured. The child's lips moved. A sound escaped them, not a scream, not a breath, but a whisper that filled every corner of the cellar. The blood was promised. The temperature dropped instantly. Frost crept along the walls, spreading like veins. Clara felt her heartbeat thunder against her ribs. "Elias," she said, "we have to go." But Elias was frozen, staring at the child. His eyes glistened with something beyond fear, guilt. He fell to his knees beside the casket, tears streaking his face. "I didn't know," he whispered. "I didn't know what they'd done to you." The child's head tilted slightly, the movement unnatural and jerking. "You knew," it hissed. "You all knew." The soil beneath the casket began to churn, dark tendrils rising like roots seeking air. They wrapped around Elias's wrists, pulling him closer. Clara screamed, grabbing his arm and pulling back with all her strength. "Elias, let go." But he didn't resist. His eyes were locked on the child's face, tears falling faster now. Clara pulled harder, but the tendrils grew stronger, coiling around Elias's body. The child's voice grew louder, a mix of whispers and cries echoing as if from many throats at once. The pact was broken. It must be renewed. The lantern flickered violently, the glass cracking as shadows began to stretch from the corners of the room. They were moving, faces in the dark, ancestors of the Morris line, their forms emerging like smoke from the stone walls. Their eyes burned with cold fire, their mouths moving in silent chant. Clara could feel the ground vibrating beneath her, as though the entire house was breathing again. She screamed her brother's name one last time, but the tendrils yanked him downward. His body vanished into the soil with a sickening sound, swallowed whole by the earth. The light went out completely. Silence. Then from the blackness came the soft, childlike voice once more. "One blood for one blood." Clara backed away, stumbling through the dark until she hit the cellar stairs. Her trembling fingers found the door handle and wrenched it open. Cold moonlight spilled in from above, casting her face in pale silver. She gasped for air, looking down one last time into the shadows below. The soil was still again, the casket closed. But now, where her brother had stood, a small handprint was pressed into the dirt, fresh, wet, and unmistakably human. Part for the unearthing. The storm gathered over the Morris estate like something ancient returning home. The clouds churned thick and gray above the towering oaks, and the wind swept through the iron gates with a sound that almost resembled breathing. Edward had not slept for 3 nights. The voice that had haunted his dreams now followed him into waking hours, whispering beneath his thoughts like a prayer he couldn't unhear. Each time he tried to dismiss it, he found himself staring toward the family mausoleum, toward the part of the estate his grandfather had ordered sealed long ago. Tonight he no longer fought the pull. Lantern in hand, he crossed the overgrown courtyard, his boots sinking into wet earth. The air smelled of rain and rust, and every step forward felt heavier than the last. The mausoleum waited in the distance, its stone cracked, ivy clinging to the columns like veins. The gate creaked open before he even touched it, shrieking as if in protest of what he was about to do. Lightning flashed, illuminating the angel statue above the entrance, its face weathered and its eyes hollow, staring down at him in eternal judgment. Inside, the air was dense, unmoving. Edward raised his lantern, and its dim orange light spilled over the marble floor, where dust lay undisturbed except for faint, fresh footprints. His own from nights past when he had come this far and turned back in fear. The whispers were clearer now, echoing softly from the walls. "Free me, finish what was begun." The sound seemed to seep from the very stones, feminine and sorrowful, yet laced with command. He walked deeper, passing names carved into the walls. Ancestors he had never known but whose presence seemed to breathe around him now. At the far end stood the old altar, its surface covered in a layer of decay. Edward set his lantern upon it and noticed something peculiar. A square patch of the floor that sank slightly beneath his weight, as though something beneath strained to surface. He knelt, tracing the edges with trembling fingers. The outline of a hidden stone slab revealed itself beneath the grime. A gust of wind burst through the mausoleum, extinguishing half his light. Heart hammering, he wedged his hands beneath the stone and lifted. The slab came loose with a deep groan, releasing a rush of stale, cold air that smelled faintly of earth and roses long dead. Beneath it lay a casket, dark oak bound in tarnished brass, its lid carved with elaborate vines twisting around two simple letters, M. For a long moment he only stared. Those were his initials, Edward Morris. But something deep in his chest knew it was not coincidence. The whispering stopped completely, replaced by silence so heavy it pressed against his ears. He hesitated, then brushed away the last of the dust. The brass was cold, slick beneath his fingers. His pulse thundered as he pried the lid open. No body lay within. Instead, resting on a cushion of faded silk was a single envelope, sealed in crimson wax. The seal bore the family crest, a raven clutching a key. Edward hesitated, then broke the seal. The parchment inside was fragile, almost translucent with age, yet the handwriting was impossibly neat, flowing, elegant. It was signed Eleanor Morris. The letter began simply, "To my blood and to my reflection. If you have found this, then the circle begins anew." Edward's hands trembled as he read on. The words spoke of an inheritance not of wealth, but of memory. Eleanor wrote that she had bound her spirit to her bloodline, refusing death's call after betrayal at the hands of her own kin. Through blood and name she would one day return, not as herself but through another. "When the time comes, the vessel shall return to me. My soul will awaken, guided by the echoes that linger beneath the Morris estate. Do not resist me, for we are one." The lantern flickered, its flame shrinking as if reacting to the words. Edward's breath caught. His reflection shimmered faintly against the polished wood of the casket lid. Lightning flashed outside, and in that instant he saw it clearly, his own face melting into another's. A woman's. Pale, sharp-featured, eyes deep with sorrow and fury. "Eleanor." The air grew colder. The voice came again, no longer a whisper, but a presence beside him. "You came back to me." He spun around, but the mausoleum was empty, only the shadows moved, curling toward him as if drawn by his fear. The walls seemed to pulse faintly, like something beneath them was alive. The letter slipped from his hands and fluttered to the ground. He stumbled back, his lantern swaying wildly. The casket's lid creaked again, this time by itself. It shifted as though breathing. Edward froze. A soft knock echoed from within, like fingernails brushing wood. Tuck, tuck, tuck. Then silence. He tried to run, but his legs refused to move. His heartbeat slowed, becoming strangely steady. The air thickened, pressing into his chest, and a wave of warmth flooded through his body. A voice, no, a thought, whispered inside his head now. "You are my blood, my vessel. Do not fear what you already are." Edward dropped to his knees, clutching his temples. His mind flooded with images not his own, flashes of another life. A grand ballroom lit by chandeliers. A woman in crimson silk turning to smile at him, her smile identical to his own. Then betrayal. Fire. A scream. Darkness. He gasped, the visions fading as quickly as they had come. His lantern fell and shattered, plunging the crypt into darkness. Only the faint glow of lightning through the doorway illuminated what happened next. The casket slowly opened wider, its hinges shrieking. And from within, pale fingers emerged, graceful, elegant, not decayed but alive. They gripped the edge of the lid. Edward couldn't breathe. The fingers tightened and a voice, now right behind his ear, whispered, "You freed me, my dear." He turned, but there was no one. When he looked back, the casket was empty again. Yet something had changed. The whispers were gone, replaced by a heartbeat, not his own, but echoing in perfect rhythm with his. He stumbled toward the exit, drenched in cold sweat, but when he caught sight of his reflection in the cracked glass of the mausoleum door, his blood turned to ice. Eleanor stared back at him. Her eyes, her smile, and behind them her will. Lightning struck the weather vane above, and the sound of the bell tower echoed across the estate, a deep, tolling sound that hadn't rung in nearly a century. As the storm raged, Edward stood frozen, unable to tell if he was still himself, or if he ever had been at all. Outside, the storm began to quiet, but in the depths of the mausoleum, the faint sound of a woman's laughter lingered, soft, triumphant, eternal. And the Morris estate, once silent for generations, exhaled as if something long buried had finally been set free. Part 5: The Return of Eleanor. The morning after the storm, the Morris estate looked strangely untouched, as though the night's violence had chosen to spare it deliberately. The air was still, damp with the scent of rain and earth, and the sun broke weakly through the clouds, throwing pale light across the soaked grounds. But inside the house, the quiet was not peace. It was the kind of silence that comes after something irreversible has happened. Edward awoke in his study, slumped over his desk, his head heavy with the taste of iron and dust in his mouth. The candles had burned down to puddles of wax, and the old grandfather clock had stopped ticking sometime during the night. His hands trembled as he tried to stand. Everything that had happened in the mausoleum flickered through his mind in disjointed pieces. The letter, the voice, the casket, those pale hands. For a moment, he thought it had all been a dream, some feverish illusion conjured by exhaustion. But when he glanced down, he saw the smear of dirt still beneath his fingernails and the faint outline of the envelope on his desk. It wasn't a dream. Eleanor Morris was real. Or at least she had been, and now, somehow, she was again. The house felt different now. The air had a pulse to it. Every hallway seemed to hum faintly as if alive. The portraits of his ancestors, once dusty and dull, seemed clearer, eyes sharper, faces almost subtly changed. As Edward passed beneath them, he felt watched, their painted gazes following him with knowing weight. He poured water from the decanter beside the fireplace, but the reflection that stared back at him in the glass made his heart stumble. It wasn't quite his. The lines of his jaw looked softer, his eyes a shade lighter, his expression tinged with something, an echo of that woman in the casket. Eleanor's presence was no longer whispering. It was inside him, quiet but patient. He tried to leave the estate that morning, packed a satchel, gathered his documents, and drove the carriage down the long dirt road leading to the gates. But when he reached them, the iron bars were already closed, rusted chains wound tight around them as though they had never been opened. He shouted for the caretaker, but no one came. Only the wind answered, carrying with it a faint melody, a woman's humming drifting from the house he had just left. He felt his grip loosen on the reins, his chest tighten. The horses shifted uneasily, refusing to move forward. He turned back toward the mansion, drawn again by that haunting tune, and before he even realized it, he was walking back through the front doors. The house had called him home. Days began to blend together. Edward stopped keeping track of time, unsure when the sun rose or fell. The clocks inside the house no longer kept rhythm, they all ticked differently like overlapping heartbeats. He found himself wandering into rooms he hadn't entered in years. The old nursery with its faded wallpaper of stars, the music room where the piano sat covered in dust. One evening as he passed by, the keys of that piano pressed down by themselves, playing the same tune he'd heard outside by the gates. He froze in the doorway and for a moment he thought he saw her, Eleanor, sitting there in a gown of crimson silk, her back turned, her hair flowing dark and heavy down her shoulders. When he blinked, the vision vanished. But her perfume lingered, sweet and ancient, like wilted roses. He began finding her handwriting throughout the house, letters that hadn't been there before. Some tucked inside books, others left on his pillow, one even sealed beneath his breakfast tray. They all bore the same delicate script and the same message repeated in different ways. Do not resist. We are one. The words began to consume him. He tried burning one of the letters, but as the parchment curled in the fire, he felt a sudden searing pain along his arm, as though the flames were licking his own skin. When he looked down, faint welts appeared where the ink had been written, and he dropped the paper in terror. From that moment on, he no longer tried to destroy her words. Sleep became dangerous. In his dreams, he walked through corridors that did not belong to his house, endless hallways lined with mirrors that reflected not him, but her. Sometimes she spoke. Sometimes she screamed. Other times she simply watched, smiling faintly as if she knew something he didn't. He began to feel her emotions bleeding into his own, grief, rage, longing. Once, while shaving, he caught his reflection smiling back at him when his lips hadn't moved. That was the day he stopped using mirrors altogether. The servants began to leave one by one. They whispered about strange sounds in the night, the rustle of skirts along the hallways, soft laughter echoing from empty rooms, candles that flared to life on their own. One maid claimed to have seen a woman standing at Edward's window, staring out into the rain. When she realized the figure was not him, she packed her belongings and fled before dawn. Within a week, only Edward remained, alone. He started writing in his journal to keep track of his sanity, though even his handwriting began to change, curves more elegant, strokes softer, unfamiliar flourishes creeping into each word. He could feel Eleanor's thoughts blending with his own, like ink spreading through water. Sometimes he'd wake with memories that weren't his, walking through the estate gardens in another century, hearing a man's voice call her name, tasting the bitterness of betrayal. She had been wronged. That much he understood. Betrayed by her own family, buried alive beneath the mausoleum floor, sealed in silence. Now she wanted more than remembrance, she wanted retribution. On the 7th night he heard footsteps outside his room. He called out, but no answer came. The footsteps paused, then continued slowly toward his door. The handle turned by itself and the door creaked open. The hallway beyond was empty, yet the smell of roses filled the air again. He stepped forward, his body moving as though guided by something unseen, his bare feet cold against the marble. The air grew thick and humming, almost electric. Down the corridor, at the far end near the staircase, a faint light flickered, candlelight. He followed it. The light led him all the way to the ballroom, long abandoned, its chandeliers draped in cobwebs. The air shimmered faintly and suddenly the room was alive again, not with decay but with memory. The chandeliers blazed to life, music filled the air, and dozens of figures appeared, dancing in silence, their faces pale and half-formed. They were echoes of the past, the Morris family as it once was. Among them she stood, Eleanor. Turning slowly, her eyes met his. "Edward," she said softly, though her voice filled the room like thunder. At last. He wanted to run, to protest, but when he opened his mouth, her words came out instead. "I remember now," he heard himself say. And he did. He remembered everything, not his own life but hers. The betrayal by her husband's brother, the sealing of her casket, the blood ritual that had bound her spirit to the family line. Edward was not merely her descendant. He was her continuation, her unfinished resurrection. She approached him, her form flickering between solid and spectral. Her hand reached toward his chest, fingers pale as moonlight. "You brought me back," she whispered. "Now let me finish what they denied me." Her hand sank into him, not onto but into. The cold spread instantly through his veins, sharp and burning all at once. He gasped but no sound came. His vision fractured, doubling then merging. The room pulsed with red light as the dancing figures around them turned their faces toward him. Faces that were all her own. The music stopped. Silence fell. When it was over, Edward stood alone in the empty ballroom. The chandeliers were dark again, the dust undisturbed. But his reflection in the cracked mirror above the fireplace no longer belonged to him. Eleanor's eyes stared back, steady and calm. She smiled faintly, testing her new voice as she whispered, "At last I am whole." The next morning, when the townsfolk passed the gates of the Morris estate, they saw smoke rising from the chimneys for the first time in years. The old manor, long abandoned, looked alive again. A woman stood by the window of the upper floor, her silhouette framed by morning light. They assumed she was Edward's new housekeeper, unaware that Edward Morris was gone forever. The estate had a new master now, or perhaps it had reclaimed its old one. And beneath the earth, deep in the mausoleum where the hidden casket once lay, there was only empty silk and the faint scent of roses.